diversity of how diaspora invest would make a clear distinction between to facilitate the
sort of the categorization and the advantages that a typical diasporan would have over a normal investor. One level deeper, at least through the lens of our own experience with home strings, we would divide diasporans into two groups: professional diasporans and then migrant workers, both of whom have a vested interest in investing back home. So when it comes to the professional category, these are people who are in the financial sector, potentially high net worth individuals, investing through family offices or through private banks, or directly, depending on the level of wealth. And the migrant workers are primarily investing savings or extra savings. In some cases that we've seen, for example, in Bangladesh, very, very good at arbitraging interest rate, transfer costs, and currencies on a daily basis, in some cases even better than some of the best Wall Street traders, day traders. But they do have one thing in common when it comes to, well, two things in common when it comes to Africa. One is that they are investing in the positive narrative of Africa. They view themselves as having a responsibility to support that positive narrative, which links up to another concept which we discovered, and that's that African diasporan investors, migrant workers included, are Pan-Africanists, meaning that when they are looking at opportunities to invest, they're not just wedded to opportunities that are emanating from their home country. They're looking for opportunities that are impactful and that impact the positive narrative of Africa. And so we had, Nigerians investing in Kenya, we had Ghanaians investing in Cote d'Ivoire, and we were in a vantage point where we can compare that Pan-Africanist characteristics to what happens, say, in Asia, or even worse, in Eastern Europe. We did a project for USAID focused on Macedonia. This is before they broke up into two countries, and also in Georgia. And you could not find another Balkan country investing, in a country that wasn't theirs. Similarly, in Latin America, you could not find a person from El Salvador investing in Mexico. So this is very, very particular to the African diaspora. We do see it in the Caribbean, for instance, where you have people from the Caribbean, whether from St. Lucia or from St. Kitts, investing in Barbados or Trinidad. So that community effect is very unique to the African diaspora, and I think is a plus. Where that breaks down is in philanthropy. So if you have a school in the village, the person who is from that village is more likely to support that school under a philanthropic lens than he would under an investment lens. So more Pan-Africanism under investment and more regionalism, as it were, for philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Eric. We just want to emphasize one aspect you mentioned, impact. I think this is really a characteristic of the diaspora investor, and thank you to mentioning it. How can we qualify impact? I would say jobs, I would say bringing also innovation, technology innovation, and not only money. I think that was also a message that was conveyed this morning, not to see the diaspora as an ATM, but as a broad, as a partner, as a global partner for investment. Now, Jonas, can you also provide your views on segmentation and profiling diaspora investors?
No. All right. No, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I fully agree with what Eric was saying. I think that's spot on. The way that we usually approach segmentation, I mean, it depends on what kind of vehicle we're doing. So, for example, if you're doing a investment crowdfunding platform, you might target it toward certain subgroups in the diaspora, while if you want to do like an investment vehicle aspect, you might target different. So as an example of how we work with segmentations is that we create different profiles or personas. So one is like, when we did the crowdfunding platform, we had Mbeke, he's like 45 years old, he has 2 children, he's married, he immigrated in his youth to some European country or US country, he's already investing back home, etc., etc. So you're basically already defining who is this person, but also how many of them, how many Mbeke are in the Kenyan diaspora, for example, or the Ethiopian, or which market you now work with. Another category we have is like Robert, he's 29 years old, 3 to 5 years from graduating from university, has certain needs, has certain drivers, etc., etc. And then you have another category of, say, Alicia, she's 19, her father is from an African country, her mother might be from Sweden, or so on and so on. Why do we do this? Is because we need to stop looking at the diaspora as like this big chunk of like group of people where everybody thinks and acts the same. It's not. It's a collective of subgroups. That's what it is. It's a collective of subgroups. And in the similar way we have an Mbeke and so on, when we work within Islamic finance, we do the same thing. Basically, we're creating profiles of, what we call our halal investors. It's just to simplify, But we do the same thing. So we know who in the diaspora we're speaking with. And then just for my personal experience on this, it's like, I feel many times when you're in this diaspora investment landscape and talks, people are comparing me with my mom, And I'm like, my mom had a certain strategy towards how she looked into terms of remittances. But then for me and my 2 sisters, we're not going to inherit our mom's strategy. We have radically different education standards, like education levels. We have very different financial status. But for some reason, we're expecting, my mom, she's a diaspora, I'm a diaspora, so clearly we're in this group of diaspora where our behavior is the same. And it's like, no. So that's why I think we all need to segment a lot more and really address the subgroups within the diaspora rather than just speaking about the diaspora as this big group of people out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas, and our best to your mother. You will let us know what sort of, we are curious about what sort of product and type of investment she would like to invest.
She actually does investment, but she does very different type of investment than me and my sisters. But she actually open to it, yeah.
Thank you again. Now that we have, let's say, a broader view of how the demand looks like, we'd like to now dive into the supply side. And one model that is emerging a lot with some challenges is investment-based crowdfunding platforms. So it's quite a sophisticated terminology, but this is a model that is appealing for diaspora. So now I would like to ask you, Elizabeth, to let us know why is it so appealing, relevant for the diaspora, but also what are the main challenges also to scale up this model.
That's working? Yeah, there we go. Raise your hand if you've heard of investments crowdfunding. Right. And raise your hand if you've invested in an African SME, whether it's through... Oh, fantastic. Okay. Brilliant. So you'll know that investments crowdfunding, the main sort of innovation, the main revolutionary feature that it has is that it gives ordinary investors, as opposed to professional investors, access to investment opportunities. So this innovation's been in the market, in the developed markets for over a decade, and naturally a lot of people, including myself, who are Africans living in Europe, were trying to figure out how we could use this investments crowdfunding innovation to send some of our savings back home in the form of investment. So I'm talking about lending to SMEs or investing in SMEs, African SMEs in particular. So that's that's kind of the point, right? You can be sophisticated, you can be well educated, you can have some savings, but you don't need to be very rich, and you don't need to put your money in a venture capital fund or a private equity fund, right? You can go straight to an investments crowdfunding platform and pick the project of your choice that you want to support back home. That's, in a nutshell, the point of investments crowdfunding. Now, when you talk about it in the context of diaspora, what are your options? You can be sitting in Europe and go to a European investments crowdfunding platform that may have African opportunities listed on its platform. You can also go to an African investments crowdfunding platform and see what opportunities they have their platform and put your money through there. Those are the two main models, and they both have a distinct number of challenges associated with them. And it's really important for the African diaspora that if they're going to use investments crowdfunding, that they're doing it in a safe and secure way, and that it's affordable. So I can speak a little bit to the challenges around those two models, but briefly, if you're going for option one, which means you're going to invest through a European investments-based crowdfunding platform, that platform will need to have had a European license. And in order for them to put an African startup or an African SME on their platform to receive capital, they would effectively have to force that African SME to act just like a European SME in all different ways. And so they will come to the conclusion that actually they're just going to set up a European entity on behalf of that African entity, and then you run into your classic problem of African SME investments is that it becomes extraordinarily expensive. So if you think that if you know that the majority of African SMEs need investment amounts between, say, $30,000 and $500,000, but it's going to cost you $50,000 or more just to give people access to that SME, you're probably not going to do it. And so that model has largely failed. There were many platforms that tried to do that in 2015 under sort of French regulations or Dutch regulations, and it's largely failed. So then you go to option two. Option two is that you want to find an investments-based crowdfunding platform in Africa. So that's one that's regulated by an African regulatory authority. And then you run into a big problem is that there's just very few countries where the regulators have actually put in place investments crowdfunding frameworks. So that's the work that I do. It's providing a lot of technical assistance to African regulatory authorities to put this in place. Yeah, I can go into a lot more detail about that, but I'll just give you that landscape for now.
Thank you so much for this description, and especially like the distinction made between, for instance, European regulatory framework and African framework, and the way that creates some barriers for diaspora investors. So we'll continue a bit the discussion at the end of the panel on recommendation. But I want to have Eric's views on how can we adapt securities and bonds issued by government or private entities in the African context. How can we adapt those financial products that exist to the diaspora investors?
Yeah. So just to Elizabeth's point on crowdfunding, I think it's important to understand the nuts and bolts of the challenge of crowdfunding, whether it's a European-based interface or an African-based interface. So we advised the government of Morocco on the legislation surrounding the launch of their domestic crowdfunding proposition. The one point that Elizabeth made, which is very, very true, is the regulatory constraint and the cost of compliance. That is one of the biggest challenges, and one that is not or at least at the time we were doing crowdfunding, was not part of the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom was that the impediments to investment were primarily in the home country, when in fact we discovered that the biggest impediments had to do with the qualification of investors who would have access to privately offered investments, and the qualification hurdles were significantly high, particularly in the U.S., which is the biggest diaspora market, being a nation of immigrants. The qualification to invest in a non-registered, non-listed security, bond, or equity offering is $1 million minus the net cost of your house. So, by that you eliminate at least 80% of African diasporans directly. And then after that, you're competing with private banks to have access to the high net worth, diasporans. Setting that aside, in the mechanics of crowdfunding, as per our experience, and looking at some of the more successful crowdfunding, securities crowdfunding platforms, particularly out of the UK, which the UK was way ahead of the US, very, very early out of 2008, in facilitating the access to equity and debt crowdfunding, is the fact that you need an anchor investor. Right? I mean, luckily for Homestrings, we had Gravitas Capital, which was the silent owner of Homestrings, which managed about $1.5 billion. And so we allocated about $40 million quietly to Homestrings, and every single transaction was anchored up to 60% by this fund. And then the rest would be marketed to the diaspora through very aggressive marketing and social media campaigns that needed to be compliant. So the interesting thing about the UK versus the US is that in the UK, you have very easy access to fintech and investment opportunities, but the messaging is controlled. You cannot make enticing advertisements to a retail investor to have access to an investment, despite the fact that the regulatory qualifications are much lower than the US. So for example, the UK doesn't have a wealth test. They have a knowledge test. Do you know the risks that you are investing in? Do you work in the financial industry and de facto qualify? In the US, you have the wealth test, but then you can go on the soapbox and talk about private investments all day without infringing the laws, particularly after what's called the Jobs Act of 2012. But to the point here, there are some initiatives that have taken place, particularly on the diaspora bond side. This morning, the governor of the central bank announced that they're going to be offering treasury bonds and bills directly on the internet, directly to the diaspora, and I'm assuming anybody else who's interested in buying, through digital means. So highly digital window. You open up an account, you put some money in it, you raise your hand for the auction, and if you clear the auction, you get your allotment of investments. That exists in Israel. I think Israel was probably one of the first ones to do that with their Israeli bonds. It exists in the U.S. through treasurydirect.gov, and it's free. You don't have to pay a bank for a brokerage. And we also assisted Indonesia to do the same thing with their digital bonds as well. So that on the sort of government side, financing of government projects, impact investment, particularly in the public sector, that's great. On the private side, you still have challenges, right? Investing in SMEs through a platform that gives you de-risking, transparency, and the qualification requirements, that panacea doesn't necessarily exist for retail investors because you still have the regulatory challenge. Now, one caveat before I close on this, the U.S. recently passed or implemented, I'm talking about the SEC in particular, implemented the last components of the Jobs Act that was passed and signed by Obama in 2012. They recently passed, where now you can create a vehicle, like an LLC, a limited liability corporation, that essentially creates a pool of investors from retail investors, right? I was going to mention the name of one of the companies, but since we're not advertising, there are these companies where in the U.S. you create what's called a tribe, right? And you have to prove that you have a pre-existing relationship with the members of your tribe, right? And this is tribe in not in the cultural sense, but sort of in the group sense. And people sign up to the tribe, and they sign the operating agreement. and then there's a bank account that's set up. They put money in the bank, and then the tribe decides where they want to invest. They can invest in SMEs, they can invest in the fund, they can invest in telecom, they can do whatever they want. That's new. This is new. And this is a major paradigm shift when it comes to the U.S. And so, yeah, that's my comment on that.
Thank you, Eric. Very detailed, very precise. I think these pooling mechanisms are indeed key to gather diaspora resources. You also mentioned the cost of compliance. It's very demanding to distribute diaspora product for the diaspora in their home country. So you need to be aware about many regulatory issues. And there is also a cost to raise awareness. So there's a series of costs. And even if we assume that there is a demand for investing, you need to be aware about those costs for a government, for a private entity. So you can balance, you can have some cost-benefit analysis and assess whether it is worth it to raise this financing. But I want to make the transition with you, Jonas. Eric mentioned the pooling mechanism, so it's important to pool those resources. Can you explain in the framework of Pangea Trust how you are raising diaspora resources? Is it individuals by individuals, or do you also have pooling mechanism? And also, if you can dive a little bit into the details of the type of investment that diaspora investors are making with Pangea Trust.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to like a crowd investment platform, it's peer-to-peer. So we reach out to individuals, and you want to, you're hunting both as part of like finding individuals, but also you're trying to hunt for groups, right? And you collaborate with different diaspora organizations or associations. So, for example, we collaborate with the Kenya Diaspora Alliance, which I think has around 250,000 members. 300,000, all right. I'm doing some marketing here. And then, because it's individuals taking individual decisions. However, if you're doing larger investments, so right now we're working on an investment case for Somalia. It's a green infrastructure case, so we're investing in water, agriculture, and livestock. And this is a $20 million investment. We're structuring this one very differently, because now we're looking into already established groups. We're also combining local investors with diaspora investors, and I think we're going to do a lot more of that. Right now we speak about the diaspora and remittances as a focus area, but there's also a lot of money locally. And there's nothing that has said that the local money don't want to collaborate with the diaspora, and there's nobody in the diaspora who says, I don't want to co-invest with local investors, right? So that is obviously, I think, a huge opportunity that we will focus a lot on moving forward. In terms of cases, what we invest in, it's generally what you would call startups or SMEs. So one is WorkPay. We invested about in 2018. They're like an employee admin tech startup. Basically what they do is they fight the ghost worker problematic. And if anybody know what the ghost worker problematic is, it's basically that a lot of government funds are used to just pay salaries for nobody there. So that's what you're like, a pretty good impact. No, but they have grown, I think, 3,000% since we invested in them. We also have Jijenge Makers, which is collecting plastic and turning it into affordable housing material. Have over 100 employees now collecting plastic and cleaning up the streets and working on making affordable housing cheaper, Obviously the case in Somalia, where we are going to be drilling about 700 meters deep and go for deep underground water, is very different from investing in some tech startups. But we really felt that we wanted to get into bigger investment cases because there is a huge case for it. And even though our home or our natural habitat is working with growth businesses and startups and usually tech-enabled businesses, we do see that traditional sectors are in huge demand. Like, there's so much demand for financing. It's insane. So now we're even looking at non-tech. We're like Forget about the tech stuff. We can even go and invest into boring sectors right now. That's a strategy. Let's look into boring sectors, because this is key infrastructure. No society can function without them. And we believe that diaspora would be a fantastic opportunity to close those funding gaps, to be honest. Before we started this panel, we were having our own little panel here. We were discussing on how could the diaspora lower the cost of finance. Could we do, like Eric said, could we do a diaspora bond offering 5% interest rate and trying to disrupt the financial sector? Why not? There's nothing saying that no, they don't want to. So like, how do we test these ideas, and how do we create actionable activities to get solutions out on the market and then let the market decide? So we speak less and we experiment more. And I think, again, tremendous amount of opportunities within the diaspora investment landscape that we really need to start exploring seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Now I have a last round of questions, which is about recommendation. I think we had an overview of the demands, the different models, and their challenges. I would like to hear the panelists about the recommendations, the way ahead, so we can scale up all these models. And I will start with you, Elisabeth.
Thanks, Frederic. So when it comes to recommendations, if we think back to the option one, right, when you're going to use a European or a US or a UK-based crowd investment platform to invest in an African SME or startup, like I said, that model has failed. There are two organizations represented at this summit called FADEV and CIWARA, and they are effectively using a crowdfunding model, but they're not calling it crowdfunding, and they're not using European crowdfunding regulations because it makes it impossible for them to do what they want to do. So there's a conversation, and here's the recommendation, a conversation that needs to happen between European, UK, and US regulatory authorities with African regulatory authorities, alongside development agencies, European and Global North development agencies, to make the regulators acknowledge and hopefully embrace their role as development actors. Obviously, it's not their job to develop Africa, it's not in their mandate. Their mandate is to protect consumers and investors in their markets. And we need to have a conversation around how the way that they do that impedes the diaspora from investing back home. So, and then when it comes to option two, that's a lot more interesting, right? So it involves putting in place African regulatory frameworks for investment crowdfunding. Most African regulatory authorities lack the human and financial resources to put in place these frameworks. So that's an easy win for donor organizations and development agencies. Just give them what they need to put in place the frameworks. Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Burundi are all working on those frameworks, and they're going much faster than the European authorities and the US authorities did, particularly on harmonization. So making sure that frameworks are the same between all countries in Africa so that cross-border investments are facilitated. And we heard earlier that most of the African diaspora, a large chunk of African diaspora members are actually living in other African countries, and these are critical capital channels. The value chain for investments crowdfunding looks wildly different in Africa than it does in Europe, and we need proper bespoke regulatory frameworks here to take that into account. In Europe, a crowdfunding platform will do everything. It'll go and find the deals, it'll prepare the deals, it'll build the investor base, it'll do all the regulatory stuff, the compliance, it'll do the legal, it'll facilitate the post-deal communication between investors and the entrepreneurs. And if you try and do that in an African context, it'll be extraordinarily expensive and probably not viable. So we've got to take an ecosystem approach to building a crowdfunding industry in Africa. And if you look into the local fund management space, emerging in first-time fund managers in Africa, there are a lot of them. And because they can't raise funds from your traditional limited partners, your traditional larger investors, for a number of reasons, they could use investments crowdfunding to raise their first fund, or to start doing deals that build their track record as fund managers. And local investors, local African investors, angel investors can use investments crowdfunding regulatory frameworks to do that in a safe and secure way. And the diaspora can participate alongside them. It's much easier to do that. You just have to convince people that they can trust the local African regulatory framework. And yeah, beyond that, there are a lot of interventions on, educating local and building the local African angel investor pool, right? Just building literally person by person the supply of capital for this segment of the market. So that's really exciting, and it's a fantastic agenda, and yeah, very happy to speak to anyone in the audience who's interested in supporting that. Yeah.
Many thanks, Elizabeth. It's like if you did a feasibility study on establishing a regulatory framework for crowdfunding platforms and building the case for diaspora. I think there are very interesting takeaways that will be part of our report. I think it's very important to trigger, let's say, that model, and building regulatory framework is a starting point. We underscore the importance of building reliable and secure investment options for the diaspora, so we need to start with existing solid and compliant mechanism. What would be your recommendation, Eric?
I think that the world is very different in 2023 than it was in 2012. And I think everything that we're talking about here is about an existing pent-up demand by the diaspora, defined as professionals and as quote-unquote migrants, and reducing friction. We are basically talking about methods, tools to reduce friction in terms of having access to investment opportunities, particularly on the private side, SMEs in particular. The public side, I think with Kenya doing their Treasury Direct, I think more and more governments are going to do that. So the public funding side of it and diaspora participation in that, that's taking care of it. But on the private side, in terms of SME and job creation and et cetera, reducing friction is the name of the game. And the way, one big change between now and 2012, 2013, is that the US market is now open, right? The SEC dragged its feet for 10 years in terms of applying the openness embedded in the Jobs Act. Now it's done. So the next question is, how do you create these vehicles to facilitate investment in SMEs that address the same issues that that Elizabeth talked about. Now, I'm going to talk about two main issues. The one is, and this is not talked about at the World Bank, actually, it's actually banned. You can't talk about this issue. But there is a marked difference between members of the Anglo-Saxon community and members of the Francophone community. I happen to hail from the Francophone community. The Francophone community is very risk averse. The Anglophone community is very risk friendly. They are more willing to invest in ventures than the French are, than the Francophones are. I didn't mean the French, but the Francophones are. And you have to accommodate for that. You have to be able to put in tools and incentives that at least attempt at equalizing access, depending on whether the country is from the Commonwealth or whether it's from the English Commonwealth or from the Francophone Commonwealth. So that's one. The second thing is when it comes to scale, right? So getting to a point where you're able to channel large flows of capital in such a way that it makes a difference, right? $1 million crowdfunding is great, 2 million is great, 10 million is great, but when you get to $100 million or $250 million, worth of investments and reinvestments from the diaspora, that moves the needle. And the only market that you can do that in is the U.S. It is the largest nation of immigrants. It is the largest source of remittances in terms of flows. At the end of the day, you have to have a footprint in the U.S. And I'm happy to say, as I said before, that on the reg side, things are opening up. On the regulation side, things are opening up. And, and it's a huge opportunity. Now, someone asked me, would we reintroduce, crowdfunding at home strings now that the U.S. is open? I have gray hairs, I have less energy, and certainly less brain cells. So I'll leave that to the next generation. Thanks.
Thank you. You don't look that old, my dear Eric. I will ask the same question to Kilian, and Jonas will ask you to be a bit concise. I would like to keep at least 5 minutes for a round of questions. So, Kilian, your recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, with my international organization hat on, I think if you're looking to scale diaspora finance, you need to start at a policy level as much as anywhere. It needs to be mainstreamed into your economic and development planning, starting with something like the integrated national financing frameworks that governments are developing to finance select development goals. And there are examples of resources being pooled effectively, and Eric mentioned them, particularly on the public side of things. Russian digital accounts springs to mind in Pakistan. India have done something similar on the public side as well, public funding side. We heard any announcements from Kenya this morning. So how can we equally facilitate that, meeting up that pent-up demand and reducing friction for investment in the private sector specifically? Can we develop diaspora accounts and some sort of a fund at a national level that is directed for specifically for foreign direct investment rather than investment in bonds? Can we do something around that? Can we mimic what's been successful on the public side and apply it to the private side? So I think these are areas that we can explore and not just leave it up. I think it's a collaborative experiment, a collaborative exploration between certainly public and private sector. And I think there's a role then for international organizations, doing a selling pitch for IOM or for IFAD as well, to play that convening role. Because certainly at the community level that we work in IOM, there remain gaps in the sort of vehicles that outside diaspora investors can invest in the local community. So how do we pool those sort of local community investment opportunities? Of course, we do have crowdfunding platforms, as we've mentioned on the stage here. But I do believe as a way forward, there's certainly a convening role that you and I can play, bringing those different groups together.
Thank you, Kilian. Jonas?
All right, perfect. I have a few ones, but we'll keep it very short. My first thing is this. India had $2.1 billion in remittances, 1990. Does anybody know what they had this year? 100 billion. That's a growth with 5,000%. Okay? So if you look at the remittances coming to the African continent now, which I think is around $97 billion, yeah, we can say 100. That means if we are successful in the next 30 years, copying what India has been doing and learning from others, we can go from 100 billion a year to 5 trillion a year. Okay? I just want to say that clearly. Why am I saying this? Because I feel like we're focusing so much to what is remittances today and what does it mean and categorization. Let's look at how do we grow it? Where is the appetite? What are we doing actively to create vehicles to catalyze more remittances? Because I feel like we talk too much and we're doing too little. So we need more on the action-oriented activities, if that makes sense. We really need to invest in that. So, and then learn from other countries. India is a great example, but there's also others there. Second, Islamic finance. This is $3 trillion market. $3 trillion market. Only 1% of the financial value goes down to the African continent. Let's not stop at 1% honestly. So I think the whole Islamic finance, what we call halal investment, gigantic opportunity. Third, there's a lot of people in the diaspora communities that are celebrities. Huh? We have the Serena Williams, we have the LeBron James, we have the Beyoncés, and Almaz, you probably know half of them in the California. No, but honestly, like, why does Serena Williams have a venture fund investing in US? Jay-Z has a $320 million venture fund. A lot of these celebrities have investment vehicles, and they're really good at selling stuff, and they have millions of followers. Why don't we do a project? If anybody interested, let me know. But why don't we do a project where we're trying to get these guys not only to take their money and invest into African tech or SMEs or infrastructure, but also use their influencer profile to not only make it cool to invest, but to pull in some serious numbers. Because we have a lot of resources in our community, but we kind of forget that they are there. Serena Williams is a resource. She's a diaspora. Let's bring them on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. We'll recap briefly. I think we have a strong call for action under different forms from all of you. So from regulatory frameworks to, let's say, raising the money and building upon the momentum that does exist among the diaspora to impact back home. The donors community, we have a role to play as well to remove the friction that exists in the market, test new models, bring them to scale, covering, let's say, upfront, I would say, investment cost to promote the different models that exist. And the private sector is at the core of, let's say, this strategy, because they are the one implementing those models. But of course, at the very beginning, we need to build some diaspora-centric vehicles. This forum continue. We have tomorrow a whole day about investment, so we will address this different issue with different panelists more in depth. Just want to take a couple of questions, maybe three, before we close the panel and before we go for a coffee break. So three other questions around the audience. So one hand, two hands. Okay. Thank you. Madam, don't know if you have a mic. Jibril as well.
There's a mic.
There's a mic coming. Okay. I ask you to be brief.
Oh, that's a camera.
That's a camera. Okay. So maybe you can speak loudly.
Thank you. I'm called Sister Rose Tumito. From the Order of Little Sisters of St. Francis, we have just completed 100 years of existence. I'm here on the invitation of African in Diaspora Network under the directives of Ms. Almaz. I'm very proud of you because you have seen that if we are to be inclusive and attend, I'm talking on behalf of the grassroots community, because as a church, the sisters are connected right in the hard-to-reach society or communities. At all times, they are there with the communities. And I have instituted a social enterprise that caters for the needs of the poor women and young people. And I'm using organic farming as a model of transforming their lives. I won an award from the USDF through the support of the ADN, and I'm using this to establish irrigation. And this is going to be the center of learning model for this grassroots community. After preparing them, and they are coming to learn from me how to grow organic farming, I have established strong markets from many schools, institutions, hotels. Now, these communities would like to start implementing their agricultural products you know, the challenges. They lack the finance to start up. Now, I become a little bit paralyzed. I'm happy to hear what you people are saying. You are talking of inclusive languages, but how do we tap your finance to help the grassroots people fight poverty, enter into the investment that can help them to become financially independent and avoid begging all the time? Thank you.
Thank you so much. On the right, I think, Mr. and Jibril, and then we will close the floor for question because we have to leave at 4.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah, hi.
be very, very concise, please.
Okay, Raul Hinojosa, professor at UCLA, in a department actually of Chicano studies, which is the diaspora, where we do remittances as a company that I started. We do free remittances for immigrants to indigenous communities that have their own microbanks, and we have bonds for sustainable development. And we're here in Kenya working with the Maasai for the same type of project. But I have a question here for everybody from Kenya. You know, there's $4 billion supposedly coming from the United to Kenya. 58% supposedly from the United States. That's $2 billion. There's only 100,000 Kenyans. That means each Kenyan is sending $20,000 a month, including the kids. So something is wrong with the data. Okay, if we need to really study that. And there's very little discussion of the U.S. diaspora here. I do think that a lot of what is going on when we see it from U.S.-Mexico, where there's 60 billion in remittances, and it's a generational thing, and there is a great deal of entrepreneurship going on. But I don't think that that's what's going on here. So I guess my question is, if anybody wants to talk a little bit about what's really going on in terms of these flows, because it's not remittances. Family remittances, I maybe will believe maybe 25% of that. The rest of it is something else going on. And probably, we find a great deal is actually businesses that are operating at small scale with all types of payments and services going on, and any experiences. And yes, we just launched this new product called Contigo Africa, if anybody's interested. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, last question. Jibril, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. In February of last year, the African Union Executive Committee, that is the ministers, endorsed a framework for the creation of an African Diaspora Finance Corporation, which, amongst other things, will help countries, member states, issue diaspora bonds. As it works towards its implementation, it has already agreed frameworks with partners such as IOM, UNDP, and has been liaising with diaspora organizations like AFORD and ADN and others. I wanted to highlight one major difficulty, partly mentioned by Jonas and Eric, in that with the African diaspora bonds, you are expecting people sending hard currency, forex. In some of the countries, the rate of devaluation of the currency is very high, very fast, and inflation is very high. So there must be a way of mitigating it. And as the AU works with other partners now, including the African Development Bank, we are working on a framework for diaspora-targeted bonds, where the issuance would be local currency, and the central banks or the government will guarantee the forex as the principal in loan, but the earnings or interest would be in local currency, knowing indeed that it's very likely that 90 to 100% of that original hard currency forex will never be repatriated but be reinvested. I highlight this as we discuss further diaspora investments and bonds in particular in the next 2 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your contribution. So we will respond very rapidly. I'm sorry for the rest of the questions, but we have the coffee break. We can continue the discussions. So Jonas, would you mind responding to the question about how we address grassroots underhavers through diaspora?
Absolutely. This is one of the reasons why we built Pangea Trust, to be honest. Because we saw that there's a big need for incubation, support, acceleration support, and how do you now channel financing to this. And I think in this space, what you were referring to within organic farming, currently you do have, I guess, a few non-profits that are operating in that space that might supply, you know, financial support. But in general, I don't think there's any clear, like, diaspora arm that is targeting social entrepreneurs in that aspect. So I think the problem you stumbled upon is there are some existing players there, but not necessarily only 100% diaspora focus. You know, I can recommend you to a few of them if you want to speak after. But I do like to encourage, you know, this audience to really look into this space because, you know, median age is 19. So there's a lot of young people, and agriculture is a huge opportunity. But then, like you rightfully said, there's a gigantic financial gap. How do we close it? So, yeah.
Thank you, Jonas. Yeah.
Sorry, just when it comes to the inclusivity of crowdfunding, your example really illustrates the importance of a bespoke, so a custom African regulatory framework. And in many parts of the countries where we work with regulators, we do see the use of crowdfunding, investments crowdfunding, by grassroots organizations, and particularly in the rural agricultural space. The problem with the regulations is that they want a farmer to be an SME entrepreneur. And you've got to look at how can we use crowdfunding to channel monies into a structure in a formal way where the people who are benefiting are existing and transacting in informal ways. So the use of cooperatives is really important. The use of as I mentioned earlier, that the value chain is very different. The use of something called a crowdfunding intermediary is really important. A crowdfunding intermediary might be a local fund manager or someone who has been successfully licensed by the regulator to help organizations in the grassroots, at the grassroots level, become eligible to receive crowdfunding. It's a really important and sensitive part of the regulatory agenda. Thanks.
Just to add to Elizabeth, I mean, one of the least, or on a relative basis, regulatory weight is philanthropy, right? So philanthropy crowdfunding, like Kiva, has less regulatory scrutiny compared to securities crowdfunding, like investing in SMEs. So to the extent that you can create a vehicle like a cooperative that is raising philanthropic money from the diaspora through channels like Kiva or others, then you're able to get, injection of capital to support these grassroots actors, but from a philanthropic lens, where there's no demand on returns, etc., up to a certain scale, at which point then the nature of the funding then changes from philanthropy to profit seeking or impact investments. Two things. On the Mexico thing, Homestrings was hired by the Mexican government to run a survey of migrant workers and professionals and their investment intent. In that process, the intent of the survey is to come up with financial products that will be distributed through specific channels in the U.S. to migrant workers to facilitate their investments in provinces and public sector and private sector opportunities. But to your point about why Mexico is racking up $60 billion worth of remittances that the policymakers themselves cannot explain, the reality is that COVID forced informal transfers to go the formal route, which gave an initial bump. And then the biggest bump, as you were alluding, is business. Businesses are now using the formal transfer mechanisms to basically finance their operations, and that explains the bulk of the surge. So that's on that question. On the question that that Jibril asked, which is a very good one. I mean, we happen to be working on similar initiatives. I've been told that I can't talk about mine, so I need to find out how you get to talk about yours. But you know, what we're finding is that. Sorry.
Yeah, we need to
Yeah.
conclude.
Yeah, what we're finding is that on the public sector side, project-specific funding, I think, would be the best way to go. With this initiative of these Treasury Direct that Kenya is starting, which I think is going to create a domino effect, particularly in the SADC region, for general financing of government budgets, that would be the purpose for that.
It's okay, it's okay. It's
Yeah,
okay. Eric.
and that's basically it.
Oh, we skip the coffee? So we are skipping the coffee. No,
okay.
And we are skipping the conclusion.
Yeah, let me-
we start in 5 minutes in room 1, so we don't take the coffee break and we go straight to the room 1.
So no more answering questions?
I think we are done.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the next session is starting in 5 minutes. Huh? It's in room 1 about climate adaptation. We'll talk about investment as well. Huh?